Okay, so I am streaming now on YouTube. No one has the link, so they're not going to see us, but.
Okay.
Good to know.
Yeah, we are live. We're live on YouTube, though. Just wanted to make sure that worked.
I wonder, do you see, Lauren, on that YouTube, is there a chat feature or something for folks to type questions or anything?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, I'll mention that.
Yes.
Then. Okay.
Yeah, so I'll put a little comment here if you have questions for Loy.
Oh, I'm so nervous about the questions. Oh my God.
No,
the
you're
questions
gonna do
are fun.
great.
Yeah.
They're not like, it's not like giving a science talk and you have really tough questions. You know, like for your defense, it was like really technical, tough, sciencey questions.
That's the thing, though. I'm used to that.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Like if somebody asks something completely out of left field, I'm gonna be like, what? I don't know. I've never thought about that.
You won't be the first Science Cafe speaker to say, oh, I don't really know the answer to that.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
But here's a place where you can look it up, or, you know, like.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's this website called Google. It's great.
Yeah. How like long do you want to go with this tonight, Loy? Because we can really cut it off at any time.
Oh, I have like 45 minutes to 47-ish kind of worth of yabbering. And I guess your intro will be like 5 minutes, right, Ian?
Yeah, ish.
So yeah, I mean, we can cut it off. I mean, yeah, I guess it depends on how many questions people have. I don't know.
Well, the reality is there's probably going to be way more questions than we can get to.
Oh, okay.
That's usually what happens.
When did you cut it off the last time?
I want to say about 7:15.
Yeah, that was what I was guessing too in my head. So yeah.
But we could go. Yeah, I'll definitely. If there's some really good ones and people seem engaged, maybe we'll go to like 7:20 or something. But I don't want to go much past that.
Yeah. Okay.
Unless you want. 15, I mean, we can go to 7:30. I'm happy to.
I think 15 is about right. Yeah.
Okay.
And we can cut it off sooner if there's no questions, or if I start sobbing, then we can cut it off early too.
No.
And you'll be able to.
Great.
And you're going to be able to view the questions as well, Loy. So.
Oh, will I? Oh, it'll come up.
Yeah, you see the little Q&A at the bottom there?
Right.
Can you see that? Yeah.
Right.
So I'll go ahead and read them just so everybody in the audience can hear the questions.
Okay. I'll just take cue from what you're saying then. So it's
yeah. And you know, there's definitely probably going to be some that we'll kind of weed out, or you know, if people ask, like the same person asks like 5 questions.
Or 5 people ask the same question.
I might actually ask folks not to do that tonight, because there were some folks last time that was just.
I have so many questions.
I was like, come on, let somebody else ask a question. So it's good though. Questions are good.
Uh-oh, trouble.
What?
I heard police sirens.
Oh, that's me. We live right off of Scott Boulevard. So every now and then there's a little.
Oh yeah, how do you like your new place?
It's good. Aside from the sirens, that's like the only thing. And for living in a city, I'm like, it's kind of not that bad.
Of course, you had those at your apartment before too, I'm sure.
Yeah. That was crazy living that close.
Are you in a house now?
No, we're in an apartment, but we own it now.
Oh, look at you.
It's a condo, right? Isn't that?
Yeah, it's a condo technically, but it's just an apartment. Like, it's just a building with, or I guess a flat, if you will. I don't know.
I like that. Call it your flat.
Yeah, like I'm British or something.
Yeah. Sounds very urban and hip.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just bought a flat. I don't know. Whatever.
Hey, is that wind?
Whatever it is.
In my mic. Are y'all hearing that? Okay.
I don't hear anything.
It's kind of windy, so I didn't know if it was.
No, you got some pretty sick headphones. Are they like noise canceling and all that jazz?
Oh yeah, they're part of my you know, package for coming on to the team. I got some
Oh,
really sweet
really?
headphones.
Oh, yeah.
Sick. That's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You look super professional. I'm like, wow, he's like all geared up and everything.
Except for the part where I'm outside and
Except for the
like
part where you're outside, yeah.
sheds and stuff behind me.
Just say you're doing like
Hey.
field work somewhere, you know.
It just makes you look more authentic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
conservation never sleeps. I'm working all the time out there, you know.
Exactly. All right. Are we ready?
Relative.
Yeah, I mean it's 5:58 if you want to open the door.
Oh, my computer says 6.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
People will get upset
I
if you
get
don't let them
6
in on
too.
time.
Go ahead and open the doors. Let's get them in here.
Okay, we're live now.
All right. So we'll just give everybody a minute or two to get on here, and then we can get started. All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to our March edition of Science Cafe with the Conservation and Research Department at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. Today, we're really excited to welcome our new Conservation Ecology Coordinator here at the Conservation and Research Department, Lois Xingwen, who will be presenting on the challenges of conserving plant communities in a changing world. Also to note, let's see. Before we start, I just want to remind you all of a few things about, just how this whole thing goes down. Just to let you know, all participants are currently muted. We ask that you all remain muted for the entirety of the webinar. That doesn't mean that we don't want you all to participate, though. We do have a question and answer feature. If you look at the bottom of your screen there, you should be able to see the Q&A. So if you go ahead and click on that, you can ask a question at any point in time. And then after Loy's talk, we can read some of those to Loy and have a fun little question and answer section. Also, there are probably some folks that are going to be viewing this on YouTube live. So if you want to ask questions, feel free. Just do that in the chat section. I also want to note that this talk is being recorded, and you can listen to it or any of our past Science Cafes on our Science Cafe webpage. And the link for this, I will go ahead and share that in the chat feature here in a few minutes. So I think it's about time that we get rolling with this. First, I just want to introduce Loy to you all. I'm sure a lot of you all are familiar with Loy's work, but for those of you who are not, here's a little bit about Loy. Loy is a community ecologist at Emory University. His research examines how human-induced change threatens plant diversity by altering species interactions. Loy's research includes not only the ecology of plant communities, but also their relationships with pollinators such as bees. Loy has worked with plants and pollinators for over 10 years, and his experience spans 3 continents. Loy trained as a horticulturalist in Singapore, where he was born. After conscription, Loy pursued a bachelor's in botany at the University of Queensland in Australia. And upon graduation, he worked as a lab manager for plant ecologist Dr. Margie Mayfield. Loy then moved to the US to work with pollinator ecologist Dr. Barry Brosey at Emory University. Last month, Loy successfully defended his PhD research, which focused on how climate change affects pollination by altering plant flowering time. He conducted this research at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Colorado. Loy will be conferred his doctorate degree in May of this year, and then joining us here at ABG Conservation and Research Department as our new Conservation Ecology Coordinator. So Loy, I think whenever you're ready to get started, you can go ahead and get your screen up there.
Excellent. Can everyone see?
Yeah.
Sweet. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for being here today. Thanks, Ian, for that introduction. So as Ian mentioned, I've been doing ecology research for some time now, and I've only sort of begun to shift my focus towards conservation in the last couple of years or so. So still fairly new to conservation, just definitely a bit of a learning curve there. But my time volunteering with the Gardens for about 2 years has taught me so much. Everyone at the Gardens has just been super nice and just very generous with their knowledge. So I'm really excited for this opportunity to join the Gardens and continue working with my soon-to-be colleagues. So today I'm really excited to share with you guys some of the issues that I've been thinking about as a community ecologist. In terms of the fate of plant communities in a world that we are changing so rapidly. And also some of the ways in which community ecology is sort of shaping the way that we think about plant conservation and biodiversity in general. So to give you a sense of where this is going, here's a quick roadmap. I will first give you an overview of the field that I'm working in so that we're all on the same page. And then I'll talk a little bit about my work with invasive species in Australia. I will then segue into the omnipresent threat that is climate change with some of my most recent work in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. And then finally, I hope to talk a little bit about one of the projects that I hope to do with the Atlanta Botanic Gardens in the future. Okay, so let's begin. We are very fortunate to live in a world that is teeming with life. Not all of those living things are necessarily benign to human existence, obviously, but there are countless marvelous, inspiring, and some even very useful organisms that we share our planet with. And I've been very fortunate in my travels to get to see and photograph many of these really cool organisms. Yes, even pumpkins. Unfortunately, we are losing our world's biodiversity at a very alarming rate because mainly of human activities. We are currently living in a major mass extinction event, one of 6 major mass extinction events in our planet's history. But the difference between this one and the other 5 is that we are in this one, so it affects us, and we have the power to do something about it. So I think we should. But I'm preaching to the choir here. If you're here today, you all already probably care about conservation. Modern conservation draws its knowledge from numerous sources. Traditional knowledge, the knowledge of non-Indigenous and Indigenous human communities has contributed and continues to contribute a lot to our understanding of conservation. Other tried and tested methods of knowledge acquisition also feed into conservation, plant biology being very prominent. In plant conservation, this encompasses fields like population biology, plant genetics, horticulture, and of course, ecology. Now, the branch of ecology that has been most helpful to conservation of plants so far has been population ecology, which concerns itself with things like species population growth rates, death rates, genetic diversity, that sort of thing. But over the past couple of decades, conservation scientists have begun to pay a lot more attention to sort of broader levels of ecology. Now, this is not to say that conservation scientists of the past never considered community ecology or ecosystems, right? Yellowstone National Park was signed into law almost 150 years ago, but the fact remains that the protection of select charismatic species has received and continues to receive a lot of public attention and funding relative to the ecosystems and communities in which these species live. But before we can start to sort of begin considering ecological communities, we must first agree on what it is. So what is community ecology? Community ecology is the study of communities formed of populations of different species. We essentially decide what a community is depending on what we're interested in. So at its smallest scale, a community can be just two species, say a predator and its prey species. A community can also be, say, all of the trees in a forest. Now, what communities usually have in common is that their species interact with one another in ways that affects one another's population size. In the past, community ecology has sort of struggled to keep up with conservation need because it's a relatively young science. However, with the help of modern technology and new analytical tools, things are changing. In the last couple of decades, community ecology has really started to become less sort of reactive and descriptive and more predictive and informative. In fact, a review paper my colleagues and I worked on found that the links between community ecology and conservation are actually on the rise. So why is community ecology important? Perhaps for the simple reason that no species is an island, right? Species interact with one another in the wild in ways that can increase or decrease their population size. So for example, if we want to conserve this orchid species in the center of the slide here, we would then also need to ensure that its pollinator is conserved, since this pollinator facilitates its reproduction. And we're also only just beginning to understand some of the below ground ecology of many plants. In orchids, the relationship they have with symbiotic fungi is especially beneficial and important to them. Now, of course, we also expect some degree of negative interactions as well. Ideally, in healthy populations should be able to withstand some degree of herbivory and even maybe disease. In fact, this may be an important way in which our conservation species is contributing to its greater community. And of course, then there are other plants. Other plants might bolster our species, or they might outcompete or compete with our species and suppress its population. So my research examines some of these interactions that shape the lives of plants in the wild, right? And how humans are altering those interactions. So in the next half an hour or so, I will share with you what I've learned and what this might mean for how we could be thinking about plant conservation going forward. So let's start by focusing on the plants, just the plant community. Now, if we want to protect wild plant diversity, we need to understand how diversity is maintained in natural plant communities. So you can consider this landscape that's full of different kinds of plants. Various forces, natural and artificial, sort of maintain the diversity of plant species in this landscape. For example, there is some level of competition between these species so that not any one species has the power to overtake this entire landscape, at least for now. But things that we do, humans, can change this. Our activities can change the balance of interactions that occur in plant communities, and this can erode plant diversity. Now, one of the biggest, most devastating things we can do to native plant communities is to introduce exotic or alien invasive species. So consider these very beautiful flowers. They are flowers of the water hyacinth. This is a floating aquatic plant that is native to the Amazon basin. Now, these plants have been introduced to water bodies worldwide. And here they are growing in Singapore, which is my home country. And beneath this puddle of purple is actually a pond. But the submerged aquatic plants in this pond have no chance of surviving, if there are any left, under this sort of blanket of floating weeds, because no light can penetrate the surface of the water. So without the submerged aquatic plants, the oxygen levels in the water then plummets. And then this is really bad news for all the animals, the fish, the invertebrates. They'll begin to die because there's no oxygen. So around the world, water hyacinth has completely transformed or even destroyed a lot of freshwater ecosystems. And it has been listed as one of the top 100 worst alien or exotic invasive species in the world. In fact, exotic invasive species in general are the second largest threat to biodiversity on Earth. In the southeastern US, has several exotic invasive plants, English ivy, kudzu, Japanese honeysuckle. These are familiar plants in forests across Georgia. But exotic species don't always become invasive, right? In fact, most do not. Like, for example, if you think in Georgia, people grow non-native tomato plants in farms and gardens all over the state, but Georgia hasn't become overrun with tomatoes. Even when a species does successfully invade a region, its impact is not uniform. For example, Chinese privet, well established in the Atlanta area. In some places, it has completely taken over the understory of forests. But in other places, within the same forest sometimes, the privet is present, but it hasn't taken hold. Now, why? Why are some plant communities more resilient to exotic invasion than others? So to better understand the ecology of exotic invasion, we're going to take a trip down under where I did my undergrad and lived for many years. So as some of you know, Australia has had quite a history of exotic invasions. It's one of the reasons why the country has such stringent border controls for the movement of wildlife and plant products. Australia has had some royal blunders with invasive species, in particular the introduction of exotic species for biological control, such as the cane toad. Now, this amphibian was introduced to Australia to eat cane beetles, but that did not work out at all. And the cane toads are now a pest, and they're spreading across the country, partly, it seems, helped along by a warming climate. Australia's successes in biological control, and there are several, are generally overshadowed by its mistakes. Nevertheless, for better or worse, the country has produced some really excellent research on biological invasion. Now, the part of Australia that we are going to visit today is this little corner, the southwest corner of Western Australia. Now, this area is Noongar country, and numerous Aboriginal groups occupied this part of the world before European colonization in the early 1800s. Now, Europeans brought with them a great deal of violence and disease to this part of the world, especially, the stealing and forced adoption of up to a quarter of Noongar children. Today, only about 21,000 people identify as indigenous to this part of the world. Now, I bring up colonization because it is a massive historical and ongoing injustice in Australia, but it also directly is also directly relevant to our topic today because of the profound effects that it has had on the local ecology. Before colonization, the Noongar people, they managed this land and used it sustainably for tens of thousands of years. Not anymore. So you can see on this map, the little dark green specks. Those are woodland fragments and reserves. And the sort of light green tan parts are the land that has mostly been converted for agriculture. So most of this land now produces wheat. This area is part of Australia's wheat belt and produces most of the country's domestic and exported wheat. Now, this sort of widespread habitat destruction is not unique to Australia, of course. The US has had its fair share. Deforestation was really intense across a lot of the eastern United States. This is obviously tragic from a conservation standpoint, but there is a thin silver lining here. The Southwest Western Australia region today remains a biodiversity hotspot. It is especially famous for its plant diversity. It's sometimes called the Southwest Australian Floristic Region, and it's home to some of the most bizarre, wondrous plants I have ever seen. If you have the opportunity, I encourage you to go check it out. It's a wild part of the world. Now, this part of Australia also experiences a unique Mediterranean climate. A few places outside of the actual Mediterranean also have this type of climate. Examples are South Africa and California, of course. So you might recall some years ago, California experienced super blooms. These are good, especially good years for the annual wildflowers in California. Many Western Australian native flowers also have a similar life cycle, and this results in similarly spectacular communities just like this one. So every year in the Australian winter spring, which is July, August in the Southern Hemisphere, these annual wildflower communities just explode, and they're gorgeous. They usually grow under these York gum trees, and so they're called York gum woodland wildflowers. And the diversity of plants here is pretty dazzling. Includes many species of very pretty everlasting daisies. Now, like the California super blooms, these communities are ephemeral. They only live for a few months. But before the plants die, they leave seeds that are dormant in the seed bank over the dry season. And then when the rains come again, the life cycle starts again and everything becomes alive. So these woodlands have recently been listed as endangered, and people are working to protect and preserve their biodiversity. But the woodlands are also troubled by a lot of non-native exotic species. So these plants were introduced accidentally or for horticulture, and they're usually from places that also experience a similar Mediterranean climate. Now, a particularly noxious exotic species is the capeweed. This species is from South Africa originally, and if allowed to proliferate in Australia, the capeweed can really take off. Now, all this yellow stuff is capeweed on an agricultural field. Look at that. Ah, yeah. Now, I want to draw your attention to this tiny patch of woodland in the back of this photo. Now, unfortunately, that is what most of the York gum woodlands in Western Australia looks like today. These tiny fragments in a sea of agriculture and weeds. Yet these wildflower communities that are growing inside these woodlands, they often remain quite intact for many decades. The exotic species aren't always successful at invading into the woodlands. Somehow, most of these woodlands have preserved their native diversity. In fact, in these woodlands, you'll find these large areas that are seemingly devoid of any exotic weeds. There's not a capeweed inside at all. Yet other patches within the same woodland are just full of weeds. So this creates this very fascinating, at least from a scientific perspective, a mosaic of communities in these woodlands. You have patches of wildflower communities that are relatively intact, free of exotic weeds. And then nearby, you have patches that are comprised completely exotic invasive weeds. And then you have the in-betweens. You have these patches of native and exotic species where they're apparently co-occurring or coexisting, apparently for quite a long time. And there doesn't seem to be any obvious winners or losers in such communities. So why is it, what are the conditions which allow exotic species to sometimes completely take over? And more importantly, how can we stop these conditions and stop them from just taking over these native communities? So I've had the privilege of working in the labs of two ecologists that are trying to address this problem. Dr. Margie Mayfield and Dr. John Dwyer. One of them is Australian, one of them is American. I'll let you work that one out for yourself. But what they have uncovered is really fascinating. It turns out there are just two main resources that are shaping the relative success of exotic weeds in these communities. And these two resources are water and the primary plant nutrient, phosphorus. You see, Australia is a very ancient continent and its soils are very weathered, very nutrient poor. And this part of Australia has soils that are very low in phosphorus. And of course, it's Mediterranean, so it's also very dry. Now, the native wildflowers that have evolved under these conditions have adapted to deal with this. They tolerate low moisture and low phosphorus quite well. Now, I say this like it's common knowledge, but of course, a lot of research from many different scientists contributed to this knowledge. So what my colleagues hypothesized is that these two factors drive the composition of wildflower communities. Now, in this plot, is their hypothesis for how the soil conditions will shape the proportion of exotic species in a community. On the horizontal axis, I'm showing you soil moisture, and on the vertical axis, I've plotted phosphorus, soil phosphorus, the nutrient content. And they hypothesize that these native species will hold the fort in places where the soil is especially low in phosphorus. But then agricultural runoff, so fertilizers used by farmers that sort of seeps into the woodlands, creates these artificial rich areas where phosphorus is high, where these exotic species can then become dominant and outcompete native species. So what did they find? Well, pretty much that, actually. In soils where phosphorus was very high, these exotic plants dominated. And these patches were usually created by agricultural runoff. Occasionally, that you can find them because where animals like to congregate, kangaroos, their waste will create artificially rich patches in the forest. But for the most part, this is due to agricultural runoff. So what does this mean? This means that we can spend hundreds and thousands of dollars funding exotic weed removal, spending human hours mechanically removing these exotic weeds, pulling them out, but they will still return if we don't address the underlying problem here, which is nutrient runoff. So these ongoing changes to the land that we're making, nutrient addition, is what is really giving these exotic species the competitive edge over the natives. Without the nutrient runoff, these native species are more than able to hold the fort on their own in these woodlands. Here is a plot of the species richness of plants in these communities. And the axes of this graph are the same as before. They have soil moisture on the horizontal and soil phosphorus on the vertical. And they found that these nutrient-rich places where the exotic species are dominating, plant diversity is much lower because, well, the native species are excluded and the communities comprise mostly exotic species. But the natives and exotics also differ in their tolerance for aridity, for dryness. Unfortunately, Western Australia is becoming drier and drier because of climate change. So it seems, because the exotics are not as hardy in terms of their dry tolerance, that this will actually give the native plants a competitive edge. I actually conducted an experiment with my colleagues here to sort of examine how changes in rainfall will affect the coexistence of the different plant species. And we found that a drier climate might actually reduce the ability of capeweed to compete with native species, which is good in a way. But of course, there is a limit to how dry a system can be before even the native species won't be able to hang on. So climate change is definitely threatening this system. But it's also, in the meantime, altering the balance of coexistence between different species in these communities. Now, so far, we have talked about competition for between plants for resources like water and nutrients. Now, what is less well known, especially in these Australian ecosystems, is whether the exotic species affect the pollination of native species. Now, the vast majority of flowering plants on Earth are pollinated by animals, usually insects. Now, depending on where you are tuning in from, you may have already noticed bees out and about foraging from flowers. Last weekend, I did a casual survey with a couple of friends at Piedmont Park in Atlanta, and we found about 8 different species already active. And so bees and other insects, they help to move pollen between flowers, and the flower that receives pollen can then go on to produce fruits and seeds. And in many plant species, failure to be pollinated results in low to no seed set or reproduction. But plants compete for pollinators. A field of colorful flowers like this is competitive advertising at its most intense, right? Each flower here is screaming to attract the pollinator to increase its chances of reproducing and being by being pollinated. But what happens if we throw in a very showy exotic flower like capeweed into this native plant community? Do the exotic weeds then draw pollinators away from the native plants and affect their reproduction? So I wanted to know, and I led a study to find out. I observed pollinator behavior in these wildflower communities and examined differences in the way pollinators visited the native flowers, where there was a lot of weeds versus where weeds were few. And what I found is that the exotic capeweed can actually reduce the pollinator visitation to native plants. These funny looking things are golden longheads. They're rather bizarre members of the daisy family that are native to Western Australia. Now they bloom in early spring and they are pollinated by a variety of small flies and bees. However, in places where it grows alongside capeweed, it becomes a little less popular. Where capeweed is abundant, these pollinators don't really want to visit golden longheads as frequently anymore. And this is not a unique finding. Studies around the world, including one published last year by my friend at the University of Washington, showed that exotic species can often compete with native plants for pollinators. And this can reduce the reproductive success of these native species. So this is sort of an unexpected, additional effect that invasive species have on native plants. Now, there was another species of wildflower that I examined in this community called the orange immortelle. And it's named this because its flowers last for a very long time. Now, this species is often also grows alongside capeweed and other weedy things, but its pollination was not affected by the exotic species. So why does one species suffer under invasion in terms of its pollination, and the other one seems pretty unaffected? Well, I think the answer has to do with flowering time. You see, flowers in the York gum woodlands, they don't bloom all at the same time. Their flowering is staggered over the course of the season. So you have species like the golden longheads that bloom in the early spring. This is when capeweed is blooming. And then the floral landscape sort of morphs into these mid-spring species. And then finally, by late summer, you see a completely different floral landscape. And late summer is when the orange immortelle blooms. And by which time there are like hardly any other flowers, native or otherwise, to compete with it. And this may be why the pollination of this species was unaffected by the early flowering capeweed. So why do these native plants have different flowering times? Well, this may be one of those mechanisms that I was talking about that helps to maintain plant diversity in the wild. Plants that can coexist together for a long time will either by chance or through evolution bloom at different times or have different life strategies so as to reduce competition with one another. Now, this observation of differences in flowering time piqued my interest, and I wanted to know how altering flowering time will shape plant communities. I was curious to know how humans could be changing flowering time to alter sort of the competition and coexistence in wild plant communities. So I made this the focus of my PhD research. How is climate change affecting flowering time to shape plant communities? I sort of left the realm of exotic invasive species and started to focus on something that in the last decade or so has drawn a lot of concern in light of climate change, something that we call phenology. What is phenology? Phenology is the timing of different life history stages in organisms, and this is usually driven by climate. So for example, when do animals hibernate? Or when do animals know when to begin their winter migrations? In plants from temperate ecosystems, phenology involves some very spectacular changes, such as fall colors, or when trees go into winter dormancy, or when plants in general know when to bloom in the springtime. Now, blooming time is especially important for plants, since flowers are the means to which most flowering plants reproduce sexually, right? This is how they produce seeds. But why does flowering time matter? Well, that's because plants must bloom when the conditions are suitable for growth, right? If it's too cold or all the liquid water is frozen, plants are not going to be able to grow very well, flower or produce seeds. Now, another important factor, of course, is the pollinators. The plants must bloom when their pollinators are active. But climate change is changing when flowers bloom across the world, especially in temperate regions. So in the US, for example, springtime conditions are starting early and earlier each year. Plants are blooming earlier, which is a prominent sign of the warming climate. However, the pollinating animals, they do not necessarily respond to the same cues, the same seasonal cues that these plants are responding to. And so they may not then also emerge early enough to be pollinating these flowers. So for example, in Hokkaido, Japan, researchers have shown that this plant, Corydalis ambigua, is blooming earlier and earlier in the spring, but its pollinator, a bumblebee, is not also emerging earlier to pollinate it. And as a result, the plant is actually suffering lower fecundity, so lower reproduction. It's not producing as many seeds. So given that plants worldwide use pollinators for reproduction, this is a potentially huge problem. However, researchers studying other plant species haven't always found this mismatch in timing between pollinator and plant. And even when they do find it, there isn't always an impact on the seed production or reproduction. So we don't really have a good idea of how widespread this problem is, and if it happens to all species that are co-occurring in a community. So we need more research to understand how this sort of phenological change is altering plant communities. And to further our understanding in this regard, I conducted some research for my PhD in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. Now, I want to acknowledge that this part of the US that we worked in are the unceded lands of the Ute people who were forcibly removed from this region. According to the website run by the Ute people, today there are about 3,000 members, most of whom live in the reservation northeast of Utah. Now, they continue to struggle with their sovereign territory with the US government, and you can check their website to learn more. Now, we conducted experiments at this place to learn more about how climate change is altering flowering time to affect plant communities. And specifically, we want to study Colorado's montane wildflower communities. Why? Why here? Well, high altitude ecosystems are one of the most sensitive to the effects of climate change, and it makes them very ideal, unfortunately, for studying climate-related issues. In addition, this is the location of the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, which is a historic research station with lots of data, expertise, and resources. Now, because of decades of long-term research in this location, we know a great deal about the biology and of the local flora, as well as the pollinators. In particular, what we know is that the flowering time on many plants in these meadows is triggered by snow melt time. That is to say, when the meadow flowers bloom depends on when the snow melts. Now, if we can somehow accelerate the rate of snow melt, then we can trigger the plants into blooming early, and then we can see how this change in flowering time affects their pollination, sort of to predict what might happen in the future. So our lab decided to try to do this. We set up 8 sites around the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, where we attempted to accelerate snowmelt to artificially stimulate early flowering to see if this affects pollination and plant reproduction. So this was the plan. In this system, the ground is usually covered in snow for from October to May. So it's frozen most of the time, very long winter season. And we want to melt this snow prematurely to simulate climate change in order to make the flowers bloom early. But how to do this? So we used lots and lots of hair dryers. No, I'm just kidding. What we did was some weeks before the anticipated date of snowmelt, we actually set up these plastic shade cloths on the surface of the snow. They look like this. So the idea here is that, well, since the cloth is black and the dark color will absorb the sun's heat, it'll cause the snow beneath to melt faster. We also set up a control plot, of course, adjacent to this plot, in which we did not change the snowmelt as a comparison, right? But what we hoped that this would do is it would accelerate the snowmelt and trick the flowers into blooming earlier. And so then we can start examining the pollination and seed set of the plants here. Now, of course, what will happen eventually is that all the snow around the surrounding areas will melt, and then we can start examining the reproduction of plants in those control plots as well. And we can do this over the course of the entire flowering season with different flowering species to look at how the communities are doing in these 2 different kinds of flowering scenarios. So we set out to do this. That's Connor Morozumi, my colleague and close friend. When you live with someone in a tiny mountain cabin for months, it's either a close friend or a close enemy. There's no middle ground there. But anyway, we hiked to all of our sites on snowshoes, carrying this very awkward, huge shade cloth thing. And this is 9,500 feet in elevation. So there was altitude sickness and all that good drama. All the effort to try to make snow melt before it wants to. So we deployed the cloth like this, and you can see what a site looks like here. Remember, we have 8 sites. This particular one is called Stupid Falls. It's named after a very dangerous waterfall back there, which adventure seekers like to visit to paddle down, which I would not recommend. Anyway, you can see here the accelerated snowmelt plot is paired with a control plot in which we did not change the snowmelt rate. So after all that effort, did it work? Yes, it worked. If you look here, the dark area is where the shade cloth was. And you can see that we've actually triggered the flowers within this area to bloom earlier than the surrounding area. Now, of course, as scientists, we want to quantify this. As Adam Savage said, the difference between just screwing around and science is writing it down. So we wrote it down. At the plant community level, this is what it looks like. In this figure, I'm plotting the average peak flowering week for species at each site. Each red dot is a community at a snowmelt plot, and the gray line on the right are the control plots standardized to 0. So you can see that we accelerated the mean peak flowering of species by up to 1.5 weeks at Stupid Falls and at the site called Filer. On average, we managed to trick the flowers into blooming about 1 week earlier. So awesome, cool stuff. Now what? Well, we want to know if the early flowering affects the pollination of the seed set in the plant communities, right? So I had 2 main hypotheses. The first is that the early flowering will change the seed set, but in particular, I expect this effect to vary depending on the species. So why does this matter? Well, studies in the past have mostly looked at just 1 or 2 species in isolation. And such studies may tell us whether or not a population is doing better or worse. But the question is, better or worse than what? Right? Species don't exist in isolation. They coexist with other species. So if we're interested in protecting plant diversity, we also want to know about how well these different species are doing relative to one another. So if the chronic changes in flowering time caused by climate change are going to have a similar negative effect on all of the species in our community, then we may not see much change in the composition of these wildflower communities in the future. On the other hand, if it disproportionately affects some species but not others, or even benefits some species, then we might see changes in the diversity and composition of these communities further down the road. So for this reason, I examined the seed production of numerous species, 14 species. Now these species are part of natural communities, and they're mostly small herbaceous plants. The largest of these are probably not much higher than your knee, but they are all perennial, living for many years, and like some of these little plants are probably older than I am. And they have rather different life strategies. Some bloom early in the spring, like those in the top row here, and some bloom quite a bit later. Some of these plants are strongly reliant on pollinators for reproduction, and they are visited by different species of pollinators. But 4 of our focal species here are they don't need pollinators for high seed set. So they either have some kind of self-wing ability or they're wind pollinated. So the question is, does the early snowmelt then affect the relative fitness or the relative reproduction of these species as they grow alongside one another? Now, my second hypothesis is that when we trick flowers into blooming early than normal, that would affect their pollination. Now, to measure pollen limitation, we need to conduct a pollen limitation experiment. This is a pretty standard setup. We hand pollinate a subset of plants at a given location to saturate their pollination needs. In theory, these plants will then only be limited by resources like water and nutrients. And then we compare the seed set of these plants to their neighbors that were only naturally pollinated. And what this does is it gives us a sense of the quality of the naturally available pollination that plants have. That is to say, if the natural pollination is top-notch, it's still very okay, unaffected, then there should be no difference between hand pollination and natural pollination. Now, this is actually quite difficult to do in practice because each plant can make numerous flowers, and each of these flower buds, they bloom over the course of the season. This means to saturate the pollination needs of a single plant by hand, you have to return to every single plant every couple of days to hand pollinate all the new flowers that come out. And I definitely couldn't have done this by myself. I had help from my brilliant undergrad mentee, Annie Schiffer, what a champ, as well as help from numerous other teammates. We had a field team of about 12 people in the summer of 2019. And we really needed so many people because this is a monumental amount of work. And a major reason why this sort of study is unique and hasn't really been attempted before at this scale. So we had to hand pollinate all these plants in the accelerated snowmelt plot. And then when the control plot blooms, we have to hand pollinate the plants there too. And then we did this across 8 sites scattered across 2 valleys. So we visited each of these sites every week, twice a week for the entire summer. And this is just for 1 species. I chose to work with 9 species out there because I hate myself. And our pilot study shows that these other species that are sort of shaded out they do not require pollinators for high seed set. Okay, so what did we achieve by this? I'm going to tell you results that haven't been published yet. So this is a sneak peek, lucky you. By the end of the field season of 2019, we had hand pollinated 427 plants. We had collected the seeds or measured the fecundity, the fitness of over 1,000 plants. And we had counted some 96,000 seeds. So a little bit of data. Now, my first expectation was that early flowering would change the relative fitness or performance of different plant species. You can think of this as the competitive ability of species relative to one another. Now, is there any evidence that early flowering does this? And the answer is yes. Our model shows that overall, the effect of early flowering has a negative effect on seed production. But this effect is also significantly dependent on the species of plant. So some plants actually seem to do better when they bloom early, and some plants do worse. But the effect is worse. Now, my second expectation is that this early flowering will affect the pollination of these plants. Is there any evidence of that? Well, I found that 4 species in my study experienced some kind of natural pollen limitation. So that means in the given year that we studied it, for whatever reason, there was either like maybe not enough bees or not enough pollen. These plants experienced some kind of pollen limitation that limited their seed set. But the altering of the flowering time caused by us only changed the pollen limitation for 2 of these species. Now I'm going to show you data on a couple of these. So here is data for the species Lathyrus, which is also known as the Nevada pea, a member of the pea family. Now on the horizontal axis here, I'm going to plot the number of flowers each plant produced, and on the vertical, the number of fruits, a measure of the reproductive success of the plant. Now we expect to see a positive relationship between these 2 variables because more flowers equals more fruits. What we're interested in here, though, is the steepness of the slope. So here is the data for plants that were only naturally pollinated, so not the non-hand pollinated ones. And you can see that in the species Lathyrus, the red line is higher than the gray line. So this tells us that the early snowmelt and flowering actually seem to benefit this species, resulting in much higher fruit set, unexpected. In contrast, with the Delphinium natalianum, which is a species of a larkspur, the early flowering actually reduced its seed production. Now I'm going to add some dashed lines to show you the effect of hand pollination. So let's focus on the red lines here. These are the lines for which plants were tricked into blooming early. In Lathyrus, you can see that the naturally pollinated plants have a very high seed set, higher than that of the hand-pollinated ones. So there is no evidence here that there's pollen limitation. If anything, early flowering may even have benefited the pollination of this species. In contrast, with the larkspur, we see that naturally pollinated plants have a lower seed set than that of the hand-pollinated ones. And this suggests that the naturally available pollinators were insufficient to maximize the seed set of this plant when it blooms too early. So in terms of pollination, what I found is that there can be changes in the pollen limitation due to early flowering. I wouldn't say it's very common in the system, at least during the year that I studied it, but it's certainly possible. And the direction of this effect can be unexpected and varies between species. Some species might benefit, some species might suffer. Now, overall, what my findings show is that the early flowering can have different effects on different species. And I provided evidence that some of these differences may be driven by pollen limitation. But the effects are not always what you'd expect. And ultimately, whether this will affect the long-term diversity of plants is still unclear. So today, we've talked about how exotic invasive species can be harmful. They can outcompete native species, decimate native plant diversity. But the environment shapes the interactions between species, and humans are changing this environment, the stage on which these dramas play out, right? In Western Australia, it's the eutrophication of soils that's really driving the invasive exotic species, allowing them to invade into these natural communities in the York gum woodlands. And this can also have effects on plant-pollinator interactions. But how else are we changing the world? Well, climate change. Climate change has the potential to shape the winners and losers in plant communities by altering the competitive dynamics of plants, even where they are native to. So how will that impact plant diversity in the future? Well, that's an area of active research. But what does that mean for conservation? I think it means that we need to continue investing in the conservation of charismatic endangered species like this pitcher plant, known only from a handful of populations in Alabama. It's in a lot of trouble. But in addition to investing in protecting these select species of conservation importance, we also need to consider the protection of communities and the other species that are co-occurring with our endangered species. We mustn't quite literally miss the forest for the trees. We need to consider pollinators of endangered plants. We may need to consider, in this case here, the abundance of their prey. We also need to manage the plant communities that this plant lives in. We need to address or at least be ready for the ways in which current and future human-induced changes will shape plant diversity and indeed biodiversity in general. In fact, humans, we have changed this world so much that the terms exotic and native are kind of unhelpful sometimes for addressing certain conservation problems. I think a great example of this is one of the projects that I'm really excited to get involved in, actually, with the Atlanta Botanic Gardens. The gardens does a lot of conservation work down in the wetlands of the Florida Panhandle. So humans, have been living in the southeastern United States for thousands of years at least. And this was home to many Mississippian-related cultures, perhaps best known for their very sophisticated mound buildings. So these are earthen pyramids. And of course, if you are from the US, you probably know better than I about the atrocities that indigenous peoples across the eastern US have faced, and how the government has evicted them from their lands and continues to undermine their tribes and nations. Now, based on what I understand from the website of the Muskogee Nation government, today they are one of the largest tribes currently in the US with more than 86,000 citizens, and they are based in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. Now, the indigenous peoples that live around the wetlands in this area, in what is today the Florida Panhandle, they regularly used fire to manage their land, but not necessarily the wetlands. Natural wildfire was a natural part of the wetlands here. But Western colonizers, they did not like fire, no. So they suppressed fire for many decades in these wetlands especially. And this proved to be an ecological disaster for many of Florida's wetlands, such as those in Deer Lake State Park. See, wetlands in many parts of the world are fire adapted. So most trees are not fire tolerant. While fire kills tree saplings, prevents them from spreading into the wetlands. And these keeps the wetlands open and sunny, like in this picture, and so that the wetlands can support all the diverse wetland wildlife and plants. But when we suppress fire, what we've done is we allow these trees and woody plants to sort of spread into the wetlands. One especially problematic tree is Cliftonia. Now, without fire, Cliftonia can invade these wetlands and transform them in a way that is bad for wetland plants and animals. The leaves of these trees, they create a very dense shade, and it smothers the wetland floor. And their deep roots, they reach into the soil and they sort of suck out all the water, so they dry up the bogs. And the dead leaves of Cliftonia also accumulate on the ground, and they add nutrients to the soils of these historically nutrient-poor ecosystems. So when Cliftonia takes over a wetland, as it has in this picture, we lose a lot of the native plants and animals of these wetlands. But here's the catch. Cliftonia isn't some exotic alien weed. It's actually native to the Florida Panhandle. It belongs here. However, it historically only grows in much smaller numbers along rivers and streams. Natural wildfires keep this plant out of the wetlands, but by changing the fire regime of this region, we have allowed this native tree to invade into the wetlands and become a problem. So this native plant almost takes on invasive qualities. And because the word invasive is often associated with alien introduced species, we tend to use the term undesirable species to refer to this native that is occurring in a place where it doesn't belong. So the gardens, along with other conservation partners, are trying to remove this Cliftonia from the wetlands, right? So that the wetlands can once again be diverse. The Cliftonia, however, has become so dense that fire cannot penetrate it. And the trees have to be removed mechanically before a more natural fire regime can be implemented. Now, one of the potential issues with this, however, is that the Cliftonia flowers produce a lot of nectar, and nectar is a valuable food source for bees and butterflies and other pollinators. If you've been paying any attention to the news, you might know that these bees and pollinators are experiencing global pollinator declines. Now, we don't know how removing all of these flowering trees from the landscape is going to affect the native pollinators in these wetlands. And these pollinators not only visit Cliftonia, but they likely also help to pollinate the wetland plants. Some of these are very sensitive species they were actually trying to conserve. So I'm working with Ashlyn Smith, Emily Coffey, and the other people at the Botanic Gardens, and also external collaborators to try to apply for funding to conduct research on the role that Cliftonia plays in supporting pollinators here, and how best to sort of mitigate any of the effects that the widespread removal of this species will have on the pollination of wetland plants that we're trying to protect. And so this is just one of the many projects that I'm really excited and looking forward to working on when I join the gardens in a few months. So that is all I have prepared for you today. I would like to thank all these organizations for supporting my research, as well as numerous collaborators, faculty, postdocs, grad students, undergrads that have helped me so much. And thanks to ABG for organizing this Science Cafe series. And thank you for joining me this evening.
Hey, Loy, you hear me?
Hey, Ian.
Hey, thank you so much. That was
You're
great.
so welcome.
As usual, you totally killed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I've got so many questions I want to ask you about that, but of course, I'm not going to take your time or everyone else's time right now.
You can just text me.
If folks want to go ahead and start asking questions, just go ahead and direct those to the Q&A section. And for folks that are on YouTube Live, you can use the chat feature in YouTube Live. And we'll just get rolling with some of these. Okay, so far all I have is from Jared Walker. He just wanted to say, tremendous, thank you.
Awesome.
And then we got a question from Connor Butler, who asked, what is your best fieldwork story?
What is my best fieldwork story? The one that comes to mind, I don't know if it's the best, but was when we were trying to climb this mountain just to get a better view of the landscape, you know, and we were misdirected and went up the wrong way up the mountain. And then we had to climb this scree, this really steep side of the mountain. And there were these huge boulders. And every time I pulled a boulder to try to like get myself on, the boulder would move, which is not comforting. But then we were so high up the mountain, we couldn't go back because it was so steep. And so we just had to keep going. And as I pulled, these boulders were like shifting beneath me. It was really terrifying. But we got to the top and it was a spectacular view. I can't decide if it was worth it, but it was definitely a memorable experience.
Good story. So yeah, I'm not getting a whole lot of questions right now. Let's see if there are any in the YouTube chat. Okay, here we go. One from Gary Rapp. Gary asked, do keystone species are indicators of these changes?
There's several ways we can interpret that question. You mean like the loss of keystone species?
Yeah,
well, they're certainly important in these interactions. There's certainly lots of models, ecological models that have been done experimenting to see what happens if you remove keystone species from communities and what happens to the rest of the interactions and if communities start to collapse. Yes, usually. But oftentimes these keystone species are connected to so many other species that they have a lot of resilience. And so tend not to just disappear from, and not as vulnerable usually, but that's not always true, of course. So yeah, it's kind of hard. It depends on the community that we're talking about. Yeah, and of course I'm thinking about things from a plant perspective, but certainly in marine systems, you can have just one species holding up an entire community and those species are especially important. So yeah, it depends. Answer is depends.
Okay, we have a question from Ali Hannah. She asks, what is your favorite plant?
Oh, wow. It's like asking my mom which one of us is her favorite son. I like epiphytes, which is not a single plant, but a huge group of plants. I just think they're really cool. No, I don't think I have a single plant that I like very much. I like that larkspur that I talked about in my talk today. That's probably my favorite plant in the study system that I work in.
Good answer. All right. And then we have from Joanne Villamarin. They ask, I appreciate your including indigenous peoples in your talk and also learning more about my state of Colorado. Thank you. So that was more just thanking you. But
oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should check out the website. There are a lot of resources online that you can use to learn more about it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that also reminds me, Loy. If you want to share, can you share stuff in the chat feature?
Probably. Do I have that power?
Yeah, I think you should be able to.
I'm
You
gonna
want to
try.
see? You could try adding your Instagram handle and your webpage for folks to check out.
I think the first thing I'm going to do. Yeah, I don't really know how to do this.
It's okay. I'm
supposed to be a millennial. I'm supposed to be good at this, but I'm not that great.
I can do it here in a bit. So we have with Emma Nigel. She asked,
Emma,
what are your biggest hardships during field work and science overseas in Australia, Singapore versus the US?
Oh, comparing the two countries. There are so many. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of awesome things about studying overseas, but there are also a lot of challenges. I think the food. As a Singaporean, we're like all about the food. So I think the food, I miss the food a lot. I think moving from a country where I'm the racial majority to a country where I'm a racial minority is a big change and a big learning experience. So that is something that I think is one of the biggest challenges that I had not really foreseen.
All right, and we have from Abigail, is there greater or lesser impacts from climate change in terms of biodiversity at elevational levels? Oh, that's an interesting question.
Is there greater or lesser impacts of climate change in terms of elevation at biodiversity levels? I'm not aware of any like meta-analyses that have actually compared tropical places to high, temperate montane places. So I'm not really sure. There's definitely evidence that, montane ecosystems and communities are sort of receding, or their ranges are shrinking because of climate change. They're sort of being forced to the tops of mountains. And that sort of has really complex effects on populations because the populations are becoming smaller also, but then it's harder for them to then disperse and for gene flow to happen between mountains. So that certainly has a very, very profound effect on population growth and persistence in the future. But I don't know in terms of like a comparison. Yeah.
All right, we've got a question. Oh, and I just want to add to you folks that I did add onto the chat. We've got Loy's Instagram, Twitter handle, and his website if you all want to check any of that out. We have a question from Robin Woods. She asked, any possible hints in a like Atlanta City, what can be done for the conservation of some of our biodiversity?
I think in a city like Atlanta, that is already, kind of sprawling and wide. It's hard to preserve native plant diversity in cities. It can be done, but it's difficult. I think what cities can be very good for is the conservation of pollinators, actually. A lot of studies that show that cities are can be like kind of hubs for pollinator diversity. It's because the amount of flowers that people grow in their gardens and stuff, especially if you create habitat for them to nest as well, cities can really be a sort of a safe house for a lot of different kinds of pollinators. Not all pollinators, obviously there are some pollinators that do require great expanses of nature reserves and things like that, but I think cities can do a lot to protect pollinators.
Yeah, and also just to add to that, one of the projects that we're working on at Atlanta, or folks we're working with at Atlanta Botanical Gardens, is the Greater Atlanta Pollinator Partnership. And that's got a lot of great info for folks. So I'll go ahead and share that in the chat in just a sec. We have a question from Heather Tangren, which is capeweed from South Africa. Are they South Africa yellow daisy yellow that can be purchased from garden centers? These should not be purchased for our gardens.
I don't know if those are the same thing. That's the kind of tricky thing about common names, that people in different countries use different common names. It can be hard to be like, do you mean this or do you mean that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, I agree. I'm a strong advocate for native plants, but I wouldn't be too worried about Cape weed because, as I said before, Cape weed tends to be is a big problem in Western Australia because where it comes from is such a similar climate to Western Australia. And so that we don't have that sort of climate here in Georgia. So yeah, I can't imagine it taking off in the exact same way, but it is something to think about.
Okay. Yeah, so next we have a question from Liz Miller, who asks, was there a significant difference between wind-pollinated and animal-pollinated plants when it comes to climate change?
That's a very good question. So there are two things here. The phenological mismatch that I described before, the sort of difference in timing between pollinators and plants, obviously that doesn't really affect wind-pollinated plants as much. And so we predict that they will be more resilient actually to the effects of climate change just because their pollination is not going to be affected. But there is another thing here to think about, and that a lot of wind-pollinated species, they have separate male and female plants. And sometimes the sex ratio of plants is determined by the climate. And with climate change, that alters the sex ratio and can make males much rarer, for example, under certain conditions. And that can definitely affect the pollination of wind-pollinated species as well. So it depends on the different species. And because this research is still quite early, I don't want to say definitely that wind-pollinated plants are going to be more successful. Yeah, but in terms of pollinator mismatch, I think they're pretty safe. Ian, you're on my.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So next question from Donna Shurrock. They ask, have we seen any evidence that pollinators are starting to emerge earlier in response to shifts in plant phenology?
No. The simple answer to that question is no. There are, the pollinator side of things is actually much less studied than the plant side of things because pollinator populations, insect populations in general, are kind of very difficult to track. It's hard to quantify, but there are studies that show that changes in flowering time actually are starting to have negative effects on the reproduction of of some solitary bees. And if that has a strong enough selection pressure, then that might shape the way that the timing in which these bees evolve in the future. So they might evolve, or they may not. We just don't know. Yeah, just don't know a lot about pollinators yet.
So the questions are really rolling in here, Loy. We've got a panel or a participant from the YouTube stream, Livia Raulin. I'm sorry, Livia Raulianatis, who asked, do you expect that over time, phenological mismatch will affect specialist bees more significantly than generalists?
All the great questions. Yes, I think so. But again, not a lot of research, not as much research on bees as there is on plants. But I think from a plant perspective, I'm certainly getting the sense that these specialist plants are more sensitive to the mismatch. So it makes sense then that the same would apply to pollinators. Yeah, I'm not sure. Again. But in terms of the two plants that I worked with, the one that seemed to do better with the early snow melt is it can be pollinated by a wide variety of different bees. And because of that, I think blooming earlier doesn't really affect it so much because it's just like, oh, well, if I'm going to miss the other pollinator, I'll just be pollinated by this one. It doesn't really matter. Whereas for the other plant, it relies very heavily on queen bees, queen bumblebees specifically. And those are very early. and there aren't that many of them. And so when you change the flowering time, that can have a big impact on the pollination in a negative way.
Oh man, it's getting super windy here. I might have to move. So the question
We can't hear
is,
the wind.
Oh, good. You can't? All right. I was a little worried about that. Do you see if there are ways the human-dominated areas can help promote species that are currently being damaged by human influences? Thoughts on coexistence? And that question was from Thomas Dodson.
Yeah, I think cities could do a lot more to help connectivity between populations in different patches of woodlands. I think, I don't know how we would get our governments to do this, but certainly improving connectivity between habitats is going to really help biodiversity in cities and in general, in sort of, even in agricultural landscapes, you know. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that, you know, in cities, we often have these tiny little islands of nature reserves where we have, you know, plant species or pollinator species. And I'm not sure that there's a lot of gene flow between these like tiny little forest fragments. And I would like to do more research on that. But yeah, I think improving connectivity would help. And one of the ways that people do this is by building corridors, right? Like the Beltline in Atlanta is a huge corridor for pollinators. And other countries too, like in Singapore, we've had quite a lot of success with building these basically green corridors or bikeways that connect all the parts on the island. And a lot of research has shown that birds and pollinators, butterflies, can actually use these corridors, and they can move between habitats, and that kind of makes their habitat a lot bigger and helps secure their population. So I think improving connectivity between habitat fragments is the way to go.
All right, this is from an anonymous attendee. They asked, do you have thoughts on the kinds of interventions which might be needed if there are detrimental effects of removing the wetland plant in your upcoming work?
I do. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to build these, what we call pollination networks in the parts of the wetlands that are quite pristine. And this is to get a sense of what resources the pollinators are using in addition to any of the invasive species that is there, to get a sense of like what, in a healthy community, what are the main plant players that are supporting the pollinator communities. And so I'm hoping to use that network data to then be able to recommend plants that can be outplanted after the removal of Cliptonia to sort of keep the pollinator populations and communities in those places sort of going, at least until the native wetland plants sort of come back. Does that make sense?
Okay, we have a question from Francis Mullen. They say, hey, Loy, thank you so much for that fantastic talk. When you were talking about the problem of caneweed in Australia, I noticed that although it's a showy flower, it doesn't seem too much showier than some of the other, oh, that screen keeps moving. I apologize. So I noticed that although it's a showy flower, it doesn't seem too much showier than some of the other native species in the area, at least in my opinion. Although you talked about how flower phenology is a big factor in invasive flowers taking away pollinators from native flowers, do invasives often also have higher nectar or pollen resources than native species?
That's a great question. To speak to the way the flowers look, the capeweed flowers are actually, at least per floral unit, if you will, are actually much bigger than most of the native plants. Like you could fit like, 5 native flowers into one capeweed flower. But then there's also the different ways in which plants attract pollinators that are, beyond just the way we look at them, right? Plants produce, fragrances and all kinds of chemical cues to sort of attract pollinators to them. And we can't really tell how attractive something is just by looking at it by eye. But that being said, the resources that these flowers are producing is also, like you said, quite important to think about. The capeweed produces a lot of nectar. I don't know where, well, I suppose it tends to grow in wetter places, so it has a lot of water to work with. And it produces so much nectar, and a lot of the flies especially just love that nectar, and they're just drawn to it. An interesting side note to this is that because the capeweed produces so much nectar and attracts so many bees, it is primarily pollinated by honeybees, which are invasive or introduced in Australia, much like they are introduced in the US. And so the honeybees definitely love capeweed, and that leads me to think that capeweed is definitely a plant that produces a lot of resources for pollinators. You're on mute again.
I'm back on. Okay, so I think we got a time for what, a couple more? Does that sound good to you, Loy?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, yeah. I apologize, folks. We're probably not going to be, there's a lot of questions that we're probably not going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best to answer a few more. So this one is from Mike S. I like this question. Is there anything in particular you are excited about as far as opportunities, trends, policies, startups, or anything in regards to biodiversity protection?
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't really thought a lot about this. No, I don't know. I don't know if there are any specific. No, I don't have any specific ones. Sorry.
No worries. I see there's a question from Jason Ligon here. He asks, after doing your dissertation research, what questions are still unanswered? What would you do next with that project if you could?
Well, I want to know if, so I talked about pollination networks briefly before this, and they're a relatively modern tool that has received a lot of theoretical attention, but they haven't really been used for conservation purposes. Part of that is because people haven't really linked pollination networks, these like numerical models, to plant reproduction as much. Like, what is the impact of studying these networks on actual plant reproduction? So I want to do a bit more of that work. And what I haven't mentioned in my presentation is that in the work that I do, one of the things that we're doing in this project is also building these pollination networks and these snowmelt locations. And I'm going to try to link that with the plant reproduction data that I have to see if this network can be used as a way to evaluate conservation outcomes. That is one of the things I hope to do, but we'll see.
Good answer. Well, Loy, it's right around 7:15, so I think that was about the time we said we'd start wrapping things up. Again, thank you so much for
You're so welcome.
For doing this
really
today, and yeah, I mean, we're just so lucky to have you as part of the team.
Oh, so shucks.
Look forward to working with you this season.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen real quick. Let's see, here we go. And just want to let folks know again, this recording will be available on our Science Cafe website, and you can see the URL right there on the page. It usually takes us a few days to a week to get that on there, but it will be on there. And you can also check out some of our upcoming presentations. Will get posted on there, as well as some of our past presentations are posted on there as well. Additionally, just like to let you all know, our next webinar is already lined up. That's going to be Thursday, April 15th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Dr. Karen DiMatteo, who is a senior lecturer and research scientist at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm really looking forward to her talk. It's going to be on using a multi-pronged bottom-up approach to conserve an endangered biodiversity hotspot, the Atlantic forest of Misiones, Argentina. Also, if anybody ever has any questions or suggestions on how we could make science cafes, at least in their virtual form, better, feel free to reach out to me. There's my email address, isabo@atlantabg.org. And also go ahead and follow us on Instagram if you're into that kind of thing at Atlanta BG Conservation. And I think that's about all I have to say. Thanks again for everybody who attended tonight.